Happy winter day, right? But look, all you came out. I'm so excited. Good afternoon. My name is Gail Carr Williams from Vanderbilt University, and we are just so pleased to be in this amazing partnership with the Frist Art Museum. The Frist Art Museum continues to do courageous, inclusive exhibits for our community, and I couldn't be more proud to partner with them and more proud to be a board member on the Frist Art Museum, and also to be a part of Vanderbilt University to bring these events to you all. So Hearts of Our People, Native Women Artists. Katie Del May, another knocking it out of the ballpark kind of exhibits. It's always a pleasure to work with you, Katie. I'm going to turn this over to Katie Del May, who is the curator of this exhibit and will facilitate our panel discussion. But before I go, I just want to make certain that this is November, and the next time we'll see you all, Thanksgiving would have come and gone. So I just want to take a moment and wish all of you a beautiful, happy, healthy, and warm Thanksgiving season. Thank you all for coming. See you in December. Go get it, Katie.
Thank you, Gail, and hello. Thank you so much for joining us today, this cold day, for this conversation around the exhibition, Hearts of Our People, Native Women Artists. I'd like to first begin, though, with a land acknowledgement. The Frist Art Museum acknowledges and pays respect to the Cherokee and Shawnee Native peoples and elders who call this land we are standing on their homeland. We also acknowledge and offer deep gratitude to the ancestral land and water that supports us. So I have been here at the Frist since we opened in 2001 and have therefore been a part of dozens of exhibitions. And I see some familiar faces out there, and I know you have been here for the journey as well. But I have to say that the one that we are here to talk about today may be among the most eye-opening for me, not only because of my unfamiliarity with the actual subject matter. Full disclosure, I have never taken a class on Native American art, but also because of my lack of awareness beyond a very superficial one that we may learn in elementary school about both the history and present position of Native people. Happily, the organizers of the exhibition at the Minneapolis Institute of Art, they go by the nickname MIA, they had a team of co-curators, Jill Alberg-Yo, who's the curator of Native American art at MIA. Jill is non-Native, as well as Terry Greaves, who is an independent artist and curator who is Kiowa. Both of these women are truly, and with the support of MIA, are truly leading the way in terms of decolonizing museums and shining a light on these issues through art. And as my colleagues and I prepared for our presentation of this show, we often remarked to each other on how much we were learning about this topic, that despite our deep commitment to inclusiveness and equity, we just had not spent as much time as we should have thinking about and studying this issue. And our director, Susan Edwards, rightly noted more than once that for her and the rest of us on the staff who were really in the trenches, this exhibition changed our lives, and permanently. And I certainly think that that aligns with the Frist's mission to use art to help us see the world in new ways. So I trust that most, if not all of you, have had a chance to see the show at least once and know that it includes over 100 really beautiful objects of a variety of mediums. There are traditional textiles, baskets, beadwork, and pottery, as well as more recent painting, sculpture, video, and installation art. And these objects were made from historical times up to the present day. What you may not be aware of is that this is the first exhibition devoted exclusively to Native American art that we have shown at the Frist Art Museum. Despite our years of really aggressively trying to fill this hole in our exhibition schedule, there were a couple of projects that we thought were going to happen but didn't materialize. In the end, though, we feel thrilled to be showing this exhibition. It was worth the long wait for sure, because it is groundbreaking really in two different ways. First, despite the fact that women have long been the creative forces behind Native art, this really has never been recognized within the museum and Western scholarship. All those objects that are in museums under the word anonymous were made by women. So the baskets, the textiles, the beadwork, the quill work, all of those, again, fell within the realm, the female realm. So Virginia Woolf was quite right when she said that anonymous was a woman. The second aspect of this project that is so noteworthy is the fact that it was curated in a very collaborative way. In addition to Jill and Terry working together as lead co-curators, they knew that they needed to have a broader range of female voices, of Native voices guiding this exhibition. And so they very quickly formed a 21-person advisory board, all female, primarily scholars and artists, almost all of whom were Native as well. And I think it's important to note that this board was a paid advisory board, thanks to the support of the NEH and the Luce Foundation. And this panel was not just, they convened for a day so they can check off a box on, an application for an NEH grant, for example, but they had a lot of influence on every step of the planning of the show, from the selection of the objects to the interpretation to the programming. So being the first Native show at the Frist, there were a lot of firsts for us as well. We now have a land acknowledgement panel in the first gallery. We are now verbally stating land acknowledgements before our programs. You may have noticed that we have tobacco, echinacea, cedar, and tobacco as materials that Native visitors can offer as a way of paying homage to the ancestors throughout the show. We also have labels in Native languages for about half of the objects. And again, that all has to do with the Minneapolis Institute of Art following their lead and their guidance with those specific aspects of the show. We also worked closely with a local advisory board. We are very acutely aware of the particularities of Tennessee's place in this history. And Ann Henderson, our Director of Education and Community Engagement, wore the second half of her title, that hat, very prominently with this project, and she came up with a terrific group of advisors, one of whom is with us today, Erin. We also had artists and some people that were more focused on policy and advocacy in DC. And it was a reminder, as we heard back from these various members of our advisory group, that this is not a monolithic group of people, unlike European American, or just like European Americans and African Americans. Everyone has a different perspective, and it's important to listen to all of those. So throughout all of this planning, we realized how important it is to recognize the whole truth surrounding Native American history, or at least to try to present a more complete one. Now, obviously, our exhibition is focused on the art, and that is our priority, being an arts institution, but it's programs like this one that really offer an opportunity to go deeper and talk about some of these related topics. So we thank Gail very much and this Food for Thought program for giving us this opportunity to dive a little deeper. So today we have 3 panelists with us, all of whom have very different backgrounds and what they're bringing to the table. So I thought I would ask each of them to introduce themselves and say a little bit about how their experiences intersect with the exhibition. So first, we'll start on the far side. We have Professor Daniel Sharfstein, who's a professor of law and history at Vanderbilt University.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? I'm amazed at this turnout on this windswept, frozen day. So thank you so much, Katie, and I'm so delighted to be here. I'm so grateful to Gail Carr-Williams and the curatorial and community engagement staff at the Frist for an amazing show and also this event. So I have taught at Vanderbilt for the last 12 years. I teach property law. I teach American legal history. I also teach federal Indian law. And my scholarly focus is on questions of race, citizenship, and really the United States in the aftermath of Reconstruction. My second book, my most recent book, is a book called Thunder in the Mountains, which really focuses on the conquest of the West. It's about what was known as the last Indian War, even though it wasn't the last Indian War, the Nez Perce War of 1877. In the book, I particularly focus on Chief Joseph and his work as an activist and his emergence as a leading dissenter from what the United States was becoming after Reconstruction. And my interest in this amazing exhibition and also just in this field is, my focus is on the struggles over sovereignty for Native nations as the over the course of American history, as the full power of a growing federal government became oriented toward not just assimilating Native peoples, but also exterminating and looting Native peoples. And there are huge consequences of that. One of them that we see in terms of the struggles over sovereignty and tribal power is the incredible problems over relating to gender-related violence in Indian country, and so that is a particular subject that that I teach, that we discuss in federal Indian law. And I'm also very interested in the art market for art produced by Native peoples, the ways in which it's both rooted in genocide. It actually begins with the physical destruction of Native peoples and the belief that Native Americans were a dying race. But it also has a role in sustaining tribal communities, not just as a way of making a living and just surviving, but also surviving as a people within these larger assimilative pressures and demands that people have had to face. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great, a lot of things we're going to talk about further, I have a feeling, shortly. Next, though, I'd like to ask Aaron Adams, who's the Director of Education at Andrew Jackson's Hermitage, and who was also very helpful as a member of our local advisory board. Aaron?
Absolutely. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, rather, and thank you so much for including me in the panel today. My background, I've been at the Hermitage now for a little over 6 years, about 6.5 years. My background before coming to the Hermitage had everything to do with 18th century colonial Chesapeake studies and absolutely nothing about Native Americans and Native American history. When I came to the Hermitage in 2013, I immediately noticed that we were receiving a request with some frequency, particularly from our K-12 educators, and that was that they felt unprepared, felt inadequate to tackle the subject of Andrew Jackson and Indian removal. And that is fair. There is so much going on there, especially for those younger grades. When it first shows up in Tennessee curriculum at 4th grade, how do you look a 9-year-old in the face or a 10-year-old in the face and start to pull apart this idea that sometimes Congress passes laws that we think 130 years later were absolutely the wrong decision? How do you confront the fact that the President of the United States signed this into law and carried it forward? How do you begin to crack open the fact that when the U.S. Army saw natives going westward and the disease and the violence and the despair that was happening and didn't step in to ameliorate that situation? How do you start to crack open those moments for some of our youngest minds? And so what we found was that more and more often, K-12 educators were coming to the Hermitage and saying, hey, can you do this for me? Can you do the heavy lifting for me? Can you prepare my lesson for me and send it on? And I said, sure. And then I had to figure out how to do that. So always say yes and then figure it out later, right? But it's been an honor. It's truly been an honor, a work of honor to get to do that. As you can appreciate, trying to unpack all the complexities of Indian removal, if you tried to unpack it strictly from a legal perspective, you would still have so much work left to do on just the human cost side of things. If you tried to unpack it from one direction, you're quickly going to run into a lot of entanglements from another direction. And so I'm the kind of person, I like to do everything well and at once, but this is a subject that's taken 6.5 years of sort of steadily unpacking. I also have to give credit to the organization that I work for, the Andrew Jackson Foundation, which of course runs the Andrew Jackson's Hermitage. We are an old museum. We've been around for 131 years as of this year, but it wasn't until 2015, in January of 2015, where we opened our current permanent exhibition, Andrew Jackson, Born for a Storm, that we intentionally cracked into Indian removal and that sort of content. So it's an area of growth for the Hermitage, no doubt. It's an area of growth in my own work. Every time I feel like I study something, I feel so far behind, right, in all these other things that I need to know, that I need to master, that we need to address. And so for me, I'm not trying to say this with hyperbole because I really do believe it, but this has become the work of a lifetime, and it's really a remarkable work to be involved in, a remarkable organization to do that with, and remarkable outcomes, the potential of being able to more accurately and consistently educate the public about the history of our two nations, our Western civilization, our American settlers, and our indigenous peoples that often come at things with such profoundly different bases of thought and profoundly different philosophies, and how are those playing out through law, through art, through culture, through education, through community building. And so I'm here to learn alongside everybody else today. So there will be things that I hope that I share that will be of interest and will be useful to you. And I'm always here to be given homework. I always start the kids off with that. You can give me homework too, and that'll be a great opportunity for us. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Erin. And finally, I'm particularly delighted to have with us Chelsea Kia James. Chelsea is both an Apache and Ute artist, but I also have to say that there is particular pride with us at the Frist. She has been a teaching assistant, and were you an intern as well way back? And now she is really coming into her own as an artist. She was even featured on the cover of Native magazine last month, so we're really happy to have her here today to represent as a Native female artist and a young woman. She brings a particularly interesting perspective to our panel.
Thank you, Katie. Magore Tavuch, Nononie Kuyagat, Moanta Viwash Ute, and White Mountain Apache. My name is Chelsea, and I am Ukampagre Ute and White Mountain Apache, and I'm from the Uinta and Ouray Reservation on the border of Utah and Colorado. We occupy 3.5 million acres, and we're the second largest reservation. And I'm so thankful to our woman chief, Chipita, who negotiated with the federal government about getting this much land and going through with their treaty when it came to our reservation. I'm here in Tennessee. I went to Watkins College of Art in Metro Center, and I got my bachelor's degree in fine art. And I'm so thankful to be here for 5 years and have this exhibition line up, as well as being part of the team while the exhibition is going on and they're planning for it, and to see the behind the scenes and get to see the process and work with teachers and students that are interested in learning about this exhibition, as well as supporting me as an artist, and had so many opportunities and so many blessings that comes with this exhibition. And I'm super excited to talk to you guys today about some really important topics. So thank you.
Thank you, Chelsea. So what we don't have in our gallery, some of you may have wondered why, but it's very complicated, we have learned, is a map that shows the change, the loss of land for Native Americans during the settlement period. And this map, while not perfect, at least demonstrates or is a visual reminder that all of this land was once occupied. We don't like this map because the colonies are kind of blocked out, but even imagine that all of that was blue. All of this was Native American territory, and now you can see, thanks to this very aggressive removal policy, that there are now only very small portions of our country devoted to reservations. Now, I think it's important to remember that Native people are living around us in cities, not only in reservations, but in terms of federally recognized lands. You see the very sharp decline. So I realize, Daniel, that this is a very big question, but I'm wondering if you could maybe provide a Cliff Note version of how this happened, really from a legal perspective, if that's the most appropriate lens to look at this through.
Sure. So, I mean, this is essentially, we're looking at 100 years of treaties made and then broken. It's 100 years of wars of conquest, wars, actual genocidal wars in places like California, and you see the westward conquest of the continent, proceeding at different paces at different times, but if we're looking at the taking of the vast majority of Western lands, that is following on the heels of transcontinental railroad expansion. It's lots from east to west. Whenever there were gold rushes, whether it's in North Carolina or Georgia, or which precipitated Cherokee removal, or in mineral rushes in Colorado, certainly in California, in places like Idaho, again and again and again, you see overwhelming numbers of settlers pouring in. You see a government federal government not willing to enforce treaties, government going to war against Native nations that tried to enforce treaties on their own. And then we move at the end of the 19th century from a period of treaty making and treaty breaking to a period of aggressive exercise of what became known as federal plenary power, where by the 1880s, the reservations were essentially established all over the country. And then in 1887, Congress enacted a statute called the General Allotment Act, which was designed to kill the tribal structure. In essence, in the words of the architect of the boarding school system, kill the Indian and save the man. where instead of tribes owning and having sovereignty over reservations, the idea would be that they would be divided into small plots and given to individuals. And that was also accompanied by enormous expropriations of land, where the entire reservations weren't divided up and given out to tribal members. Instead, tribal members got just small plots, and the rest were just sold off in the market. So you see reservations reduced and reduced and reduced, and then inside Indian country, inside areas over which Native nations have sovereignty, you see land ownership assuming kind of a checkerboard quality, where some of the land is owned by tribes, some of it is owned by Native individuals, their allotments, and then a lot of the land is owned by non-Indians. And over time, the federal government in the late 20s into the 30s began trying to support Native tribal structures, but then it would reverse again. And in the 1950s, there was another massive wave of land being taken out of trust status. There was another major statute called Public Law 280, which established state jurisdiction over large swaths of tribal land for many kinds of situations. And so, what we see is just an enormous expropriation of land, an enormous taking of people's ways of life. And it happens, over a century, but it really feels like a very short period of time.
Thank you. And Aaron, can you remind us of Jackson's role in this, specifically the Indian Removal Act?
Sure. So Andrew Jackson sort of sits at this very critical crossroads in the entire process. It is certainly the case that Andrew Jackson was not the first of our presidents to consider the idea of removal, to consider the possibilities of mass removal. We often lay that charge directly at Thomas Jefferson's feet. Part of Jefferson's justification to Congress, part of his persuasion to Congress why we should purchase Louisiana Territory, all west of the Mississippi River, is to have a place where Native Americans can be pushed when we decide that they cannot assimilate into white society, into Western society. And so that was an idea that was first primarily articulated by Thomas Jefferson. Of course, before him, John Adams, George Washington were very much in favor of the assimilation concept, because without assimilation, it was inevitable in their minds that Native peoples would just simply be wiped out of existence, and that would just happen, that would be an inevitable outcome. Andrew Jackson, though, 1829 comes into the presidency, and the first year of Jackson's presidency is largely characterized by a lot of internal turmoil in his cabinet and in his administration, but externally it's also characterized by what is happening with the discovery of gold in Georgia, in the state of Georgia, and the complications between the state government, the federal government, over who does in fact have sovereignty over that Cherokee territory. The state of Georgia is passing more and more laws that are restrictive against the Cherokee people, that are meant to apply to Cherokee citizens of sovereign territory. They have to sort of constantly be reminded by the Supreme Court and others that no, they have sovereign rights and you don't have the right to interfere. But there's a great deal of confusion. The precedent that the federal government exercises a much more defining power over the states was not a settled concept in Jackson's time. And so Georgia puts up a lot of resistance to this. When it becomes a point in which violence is beginning to be raised on the frontier, people are looking to the President of the United States to step in and just solve the problem. And so Jackson, of course, then approaches Congress, and especially in his second annual message to Congress, lays out what he believes is the right solution, what he's encouraging Congress to craft and to pass, because of course that is their responsibility to pass that law. When it's passed, Jackson signs it, immediately. So it's a concept that goes from articulation to fulfillment in something like 2 or 3 months' time. That Jackson has this signed. So the Indian Removal Act is signed into law in May of 1830. That becomes the foundational law for everything that follows afterwards. So everything that Professor Sharpstein is mentioning in terms of the allotment system, expropriations, the concentration of Native peoples into reservations and then off of reservations, and citizenship status and land rights and mineral rights and all those sorts of things, all of that has its anchoring legal underpinnings in the Indian Removal Act. And that is what Jackson sets into motion in 1830. So while there are many things that Jackson himself is not directly responsible for in terms of being sort of the mover of the strings in that particular event, it is without a doubt that without the passage of the Indian Removal Act, it calls into question everything that follows it. When would it have happened? Would it have happened? Would it have happened in the way it did happen? What would have been the options otherwise? But that is certainly something that rests directly on Jackson's shoulders. A colleague of mine said recently, and I'm totally stealing this from him, but that if Jackson were to come back to life today, the 2 things that would surprise him the most would be that people today criticize him for his ownership of slaves, because that was certainly accepted in common practice at the time. And he would also be surprised at the fact that people criticize him about Indian removal. I have to sometimes remind people, too, that Jackson doesn't necessarily embrace or represent a unique sort of form of evil in that way. There are many people who supported Jackson's idea. You look at the vote in the Senate, for example, and there is no contest. The United States Senate is perfectly happy to write the Indian Removal Act and pass it on. The House of Representatives presents a much more interesting study to us, but ultimately they pass it as well. So it's a lot of players and a lot of directions, but sort of that guiding thought, that guiding direction to it, and ultimately the signature on the paper that makes it applicable law in the United States rests squarely on Jackson's shoulders.
Thank you, but it sounds like it ran deep and long in terms of the history. Well, in addition to removal, there were also policies for assimilation that both of you all have mentioned, and one of the most tragic and kind of heartbreaking to me is the idea of these boarding schools that children were often sent to against the will of their family. And Chelsea, I think this is something that your family has been impacted by, and I'm wondering if you could maybe share a little bit more about what these boarding schools were and what the impact has been. Sorry. Do you need me to repeat the question? No, okay.
So I think an important thing that we're getting from both of their discussions is that Natives, whenever they ask, like tribal affiliation to other Natives, they don't really say like what tribe are you from? They say, like what land are you from? What land do you belong to? And removing Natives from the land where they're born from is already beginning the assimilation process. You can't simply just move Natives and expect them to continue on with their culture, because we have such a deep connection to where we are from originally. And to also stop the process of a nomadic people is traumatizing to their lifestyle. A lot of the time Natives were nomadic. We would travel season to season. So to put them also in boarding schools where we halt completely all of our culture, this boarding school process was not some, like sign our kids up, we're gonna send them off to get a better education and opportunity. They were forced from their families to go to boarding schools. They were forced to strip their names, and they were stripped of everything. I mean, their original clothing, their hair, they weren't allowed to speak their language. And a really great recent movie, I believe it's called Indian Horse or Crazy Horse, I'm not too sure, talks about in the First Nations, kind of this boarding school process. So if you guys are interested, that's a recent 2018 movie, I believe. And it's based off from a book, and it goes really in depth of one young man's experience during his boarding school. But this Luann Neal, this is in the gallery, and it's a collection of photos of boarding school students. And the most like striking thing to me, which, you know, like is, you know, they're wearing uniforms, they're wearing unison outfits, but it's the hair for me. The hair always gets me. Natives have such a strong connection culturally to their hair. They think of it as an extension of their life and their thoughts. And when we mourn, we cut off our hair, and we give it to our family member, and we bury it with them. So Natives have a very, very strong connection to their hair. And I saw in Arizona, I'm forgetting the museum, they had a boarding school chair that they had, and it displayed how, you know, like the hair that would be cut off from students, and it just hit me so hard. It was so impactful, and the connection is just too strong with Natives and their hair, and to have that taken away is just, it's so visually hard to look at. But to remove and assimilate and to relocate and then be displaced, and then not allowed to speak your native language, not allowed to see your family. That's what boarding schools are. My last name is James, and my dad's last name is James, and his father's name was James, and that's because my grandfather went through boarding school, and they stripped his name and gave him the last name James. My traditional last name is Bullet Head, and we no longer carry that name. And that's most particularly lately why I've been going by Chelsea Kaya, because those were given names, and James is more of a government given name. So, yeah.
Wow, and my understanding is that boarding schools didn't really go out of existence until the 1970s, which is pretty remarkable.
There was actually a boarding school in Canada until 1995. So in the U.S., I believe they ended around the 70s, and we still have some of those establishments around reservations that are now vandalized. But I believe in Canada, they had them until like 1995 or 1997. I'm not.
Well, despite or perhaps as a result of policies of removal and assimilation, a kind of cult of romanticism around Indigenous peoples has also developed. One of the most, and many artists have, especially over 100 years ago, have made artworks that are meant to kind of, you know, preserve this culture, or these dying peoples. One of the most famous examples being Edward Curtis's series of photographs, and this work, The Vanishing Race, that he worked for almost 20 years trying to capture photographs of Native peoples in their traditional way of life and regalia. And I guess I'm wondering, Chelsea, again, being the only Native person on our panel, if you could maybe share any experiences that you've had with being considered, you know, only part of history and part of this vanishing race. We were told over and over by some of our advisory members, you know, don't speak about us in the past tense. We're very much here.
Yeah, we are very much here. And I think I get it. I get where stereotypes come from, and I've lived out of my reservation for quite a few years now, and I see the underrepresentation. I see Native art really only being in the historical section, usually in museums, and nothing contemporary. And so I see where these stereotypes and where this misconception that there's not really natives anymore, and if there are natives, they still live in teepees, or they still ride horses as a main source of vehicular transportation, or they still wear regalia. And the greatest thing to me is kind of motioning towards myself and being like, no, this is how we dress, you know, this is how we live, and this is what we do, and this is what we represent still. And of course, the romanticization of Native people hasn't been helped through art or through movies. Usually, typically, is where people see the romanticization of Native people. But if you're in an art scene, Edward Curtis, I feel for what he was trying to do. And it's not that he's backlashed in the Native community. We see what he's trying to do, but it's a position that he took on, that he imposed for himself. And that's kind of where the translation gets lost for what he's doing. And I believe, not this photo, but he has captured natives in sacred ceremonies with sacred objects. And I believe at the time he knew what he was doing and what he could benefit from doing it, but the natives that were taking the photos, or often the subjects, didn't really know where it was going. You know, they didn't really know the contemporary world, where these photos would go, and where they are now, and kind of how they exist. So that there was no comprehension of, how they could have thought about that.
Okay, well, we've talked a lot about the past, and this past, of course, very much impacts the present moment, and Native peoples continue to be grappling with, some of these very tough issues. Others include the violation of sacred ancestral lands and matters of legal jurisdiction on reservations. And many of these topics are addressed in the artworks in our exhibition, all of which are under the frame of, or the themes of legacy, relationships, and power. And so now what I'd like to do is maybe present some of those works now, and ask you all to maybe share what these works mean to you, what you think the artist's intention is, and maybe your own personal reflection as well. And we'll start off with this work, arguably the toughest in the show.
This is by Rebecca Belmore. And I think as a contemporary Native woman, I instantly was impacted by this image because I knew exactly what it meant. But I strongly want to talk about this image specifically versus anything in the exhibition, because it's very close to home, and it's also very, very important and very relevant. This represents the missing and murdered Indigenous women epidemic happening in the Native community right now. Visually, in art historically, it looks like Ingres' odalisque images, and Manet, his Olympia, and those are images of very sexualized women, and kind of expose the body of a female for gaze. And it also takes on kind of environmentally a critique on Western medicine, being sterile and cold, and then you kind of look at the image more, and it starts looking a bit morgue-like. Like it looks like a practice or a morgue table. And she has this slashed back, which is sutured, and it's very nice. It's very symmetrical and even. It's not like a ghastly slash, but it represents the colonial possession and the violence against Native women bodies. And you can kind of tell it's a Native woman body, not because it's in a Native woman exhibition, but because it has this fringe. And she's also critiquing the stereotypes with, like beaded fringe being nativeness. And so she uses this as a ploy for you to really grasp that this is a Native woman body, and then this has been imposed on her. And, the red can represent blood, but red also represents power in the Native community. And red also represents the missing and murdered Indigenous women movement. A lot of the times in the community, you'll see Native women wearing red dresses or a red handprint over their mouths for their silent sisters. So this is like a ode to so many different things, but to me the fringe is not only addressing the nativeness, but also the red that represents this epidemic going on in the Native community. And it's not an epidemic in the sense that, this is only specific to certain communities. This is the whole Native community in Canada, in the United States, and it's 84% of the women in the community have experienced violence. 4 out of 5 women have experienced abuse or sexual violence, and they're 10 times more likely to be murdered than any other race. This is astronomical, and I am not stressing this enough that there's not going to be a Native that you won't meet that isn't affected by this. And it's a travesty. It's a direct connection to historically how Native people have been treated and what Native women mean to society, because it means something completely different in Native societies. We are run by women, Native societies. Everything that is Native revolves around women, and we are such an important, integral part. And for contemporary actions to be so against Native women, you have to understand the power that we have in this community, because we have such violence against us. And I would love for there to be more of a base history of Native travesties and history and the injustices, to see how it affects people's view on this, because I think the injustices start from the lack of education of what's been done to Native people and how Native society works, the importance and the integral part of Native women in our society. So not just for Native society, but for all of the U.S. society.
Professor Sharfstein, could you maybe explain a little bit about some of the legal structures that have allowed this to really happen?
Sure. So much of this epidemic is of our own doing. So, if we think about what does it really mean when I talk about stripping sovereignty, stripping jurisdiction from Native nations, it's all very abstract. But if you look at the epidemic of gender-related violence, it's a direct consequence. So the way criminal jurisdiction works in Indian country is through a patchwork of statutes and Supreme Court decisions. Is actually a race-based system. So it depends on the race of the perpetrator, the race of the victim, and for lots of cases, it also depends on whether the land, where a crime is committed is trust land, or is it not owned in trust if it's individually owned, if it's owned by non-Indians. And what winds up happening is there are all these crimes where the tribe has no jurisdiction to investigate and make arrests. Instead, they're relying on possibly, they have to work with FBI, who are often hours and hours, hundreds of miles away, and not going to spend very much time investigating crimes. Or they have to work with state criminal authorities, which are really, local sheriffs and local police departments, who also don't have they may not have the resources. They certainly don't have the interest or political will to systematically investigate and make arrests in cases. So crimes happen again and again and again, and various authorities, look at each other and aren't sure who has the power to act, and then no one acts. So the crimes continue and they cascade. The Indian Law Resource Center actually has a lot of material relating to gender-related violence and this epidemic. There are all kinds of proposals for how to reform it, but the Congress certainly is not acting very quickly or aggressively.
Okay. Now, this work, actually, Chelsea, I thought it was really interesting when you said that Native peoples don't say to each other or ask each other, what nation are you from, but what land are you from? And this photograph has to do with the Dakota Access Pipeline that is currently runs through Standing Rock Reservation, which of course is in the Dakotas, and you are from the Southwest. But this issue really resonated well beyond those particular nations, kind of became a pan-Native cause, and certainly many non-Natives became involved in this, in activism against this as well. The photographer, in fact, who made this photograph is Alaskan Tlingit, and I'm wondering, this also has to do with sovereignty and this connection to the land. I'm wondering if anyone would like to kind of broaden the conversation around this topic. And here's an installation from Mia that shows other works related to Standing Rock.
And I would like to mention, just real quick, a comment that the Dakota Access Pipeline is leaking right now. That's current. It's leaking thousands of gallons of oil, which, Native communities were worried about, and this is why we protested it, is the leaking and the environmental damage that it does, as well as that there are still protesters in jail for this while this pipeline is leaking. So, just
I'm glad you added that for sure.
Katie, would you mind going back to the Standing Rock photo real quick? I wanted to thank you. So one of the issues that really stands out for me, both just in my daily work and in our conversations around today and around this exhibit, I go back again and again to Jackson and his contemporaries. Jackson particularly is often framing the decisions of the United States. Part of the rhetoric that comes back to the people of the United States is always being cast in this idea of what the character of our nation is. What is the character of the American people? How does the president speak for the character of the people, right? How does he represent that? Both when the Indian Removal Act is passed, in Jackson's many messages to Congress and others about it, he goes back again and again that we do this, that we move natives because it is the character of our people. The way in which we do it, which is that we will give them land to move to, and that's going to help them preserve their heritage and traditions. We do that because we're Americans, and that's what we stand for, helping people continue their heritage and traditions. And when I look at this picture, and when I first came through the exhibit, I had to stand with it for just a moment and try to absorb what that means, right? Like, what is the character of the American people? What is the character of our nation and what we stand for? And I had to do a lot of battle with this one. And it comes back in many ways to a profound disconnect, I think, between the land and the nation. That there is a profound disconnect in the way that Western societies view nations and the way that Native nations view nations. The connection to the land and the environment, I think, is certainly the central piece. Jackson articulates this idea that by moving natives from the southeastern United States to Oklahoma, what is now Oklahoma, is going to help them preserve their heritage and traditions. But he does it with so little understanding of what their heritage and traditions are. The idea, for example, that Cherokee people, for example, who largely depend on river cane, which is a grass and a woody material that's native to the southeastern United States, found in abundance, found along waterways. It is not native to Oklahoma. So all of a sudden, what are homes supposed to be built out of? What are baskets supposed to be woven out of? How are weapons supposed to be fashioned now if you do not have this particular object? And I think that so profoundly with the issue of the pipeline at Standing Rock, right? You have oil leaking into the ground. We didn't accept it when oil was leaking into in Alaska after the Valdez leak in the 1980s. We didn't accept it when the pipeline exploded in the Gulf of Mexico in 2010. What is so different about this particular incident that we can't seem to get some quick resolution, right? About the environmental impact on it, about the effect on the reservation and the Standing Rock peoples. All of that together is just sort of wound up into one big tangle in my own mind, and I think for many people.
Yeah, I look at this image and I see a very traditional, echoes of traditional patriotic images, right? Someone holding a flag. You could imagine the paintings of the fife and drummer, in tri-corner hats, right, in a line, and thinking about the tradition of this kind of protest, there are deep roots in environmental protests. So the expansion and encroachment of settlers onto native lands, from the beginning, was environmentally devastating, right? It's plowing over bunch grass in the West so people could plant corn. People were complaining about that. Farming was devastating. Mining was devastating. The killing of the bison herds, right, was environmental devastation. And so this is part of a long tradition. And then there are these very long traditions of Native descent, where, in many ways, the Dakota Access Pipeline protests have been so successful and so resilient, in part because it recognizes something that many Native protesters and dissenters over centuries have figured out, which is something fundamental about the nature of American power. It's split in so many ways, right? There's the president, there's the Congress, there are the courts, there are the president's agencies, there's local agencies, there's state government. Power is just sliced and diced among so many different parties and so many different people whose their power overlaps. They compete with each other. And so if you make your case, there are all kinds of different forums where you can gain traction, right? And if you persist in your protest, if you persist in putting your position forward, there is a very good chance that your persistence can be leveraged into something real. It can be leveraged into rights.
And that goes into resilience and tradition and respect. in Native ceremonies, I don't think most people realize they're not holding the flags in disrespect. Native communities honor every single time we have a ceremony. We have flag ceremonies. We honor the American flag along with our tribal flags. We have veteran songs. We have war songs. We have, we have respect and dignity for the American flag as well as America and what it represents, but individually to us in our community, it just means something different to us. I had someone question this and, like they thought they were like disrespecting the flag. So I just wanted to point that out, that it's not disrespect on the flag, that we have honor, flag honor songs. So I just wanted to mention that.
Thanks. We are suddenly and somehow already at an hour, but I do want to, I want to end on a positive note. We've talked about some really heavy topics, and that's part of the healing process, is to tell the whole truth or to expose more of the truth than what is traditionally taught. So that's important, but I also want to end, maybe Chelsea, by you speaking about one of your works. I'll just briefly note this is another work that has to do with the interconnected relationship between Native peoples and the natural world, in this case specifically the buffalo that were so critical to Plains people's way of life, both in them being gone created both cultural and social devastation and environmental devastation. This piece is looking at the interconnectedness with us all having, featuring both plants and birds and small insects that are on the endangered species list in Canada. This is a beautiful piece of beadwork made by 3 generations of female artists. And we'll just skip ahead. I'm sorry, we're not there's so many things we're not talking about. But again, I think it's really important to maybe end our conversation with legacy and looking at this piece of work made by a young Native female artist.
So this is Yokovich, which means coyote and Ute. And the coyote in many tribes represents the trickster and a chaos creator. And I love using the coyote in my imagery. And this is done with traditional quill work and glass beads, charlotte cut, and rhinestone binding. And on the back, it's backed with buckskin now. And I finished this piece this year. It took me about 4 months. You can kind of see in here because it's blown up so big. I individually tacked down each bead, and that's kind of why you see it so neat and pristine. And that's because I tacked down each and every bead to make sure that was going the direction that I wanted it to go. And I often in my artwork portray my Native Ute creation story, a lot of my Native experience and heritage, and I am just so appreciative of Katie and the educational team and the other panelists for their knowledge, because the Native community has really survived one of the longest genocidal efforts against a culture. And not to take away, but also to discuss these big topics, but not taking away any negative feelings. There's no negative feelings here. There's no negative feelings in the exhibition. It's all awareness and power and decolonization and indigenizing stuff. And we're here and we're powerful, and it's only going to be more de-assimilated in the future. And with everybody's awareness and efforts and openness to listening, that's all that we can do to start a new generation more aware, and more together.
Beautiful. Well, I certainly can't top those closing remarks, so I won't try. The only thing I would just like to add is that another young female Native artist will be here on Thursday night, Rose Simpson, the creator of the El Camino in the First Gallery. She will be speaking at 6:30 here in the auditorium, a free program as always, and so we invite you to learn more in just a few days. So thank you to our panelists. Thank you all again for braving the weather and joining us for this very important conversation.